anytime you're confronted with a book called something like On Women, there is an irritating but not incorrect voice in the back of your head that says, well, which women? For which women? The three of us sitting here represent three different subject positions for women, as do many of the people sitting in the audience tonight. And I thought that what I would start by asking Sigrid and Doreen to reflect on is how you go from something like the experience of being one woman, a singular woman, who occupies and speaks from a very particular position, to thinking about this very large and ever-expanding category. How do we go from woman to women? Either of you can start.
Doreen. You put me on the spot. Well, I guess I have naturally an ambivalent relationship to the notion of spokesmanship that I think gets foisted onto Black women, which is the position that I represent, that you were alluding to, at a higher peak than it does other groups of people who fall under the category of woman. And I've found actually in my writing that ambivalence manifests in the annihilation of self. So I hardly ever write from the first person. And I try to, as a critic, I mostly write about film, culture, politics, to do what equates to reportage. And criticism, it's a little bit dicey where reporting is, as opposed to other forms of journalism. And that just goes to say that I have a lot of fear and ambivalence about that transition, going from that space of individuality, which I think is also something that will come up in our conversation, because what is so interesting about this collection is we see Sontag sort of grappling with her grandiose, glamorous individuality and writing, during this understudied period of time in her oeuvre about the importance of the collective. And so, yeah, I think I'm just at a point where I almost try to ignore that I am beginning from that place of subjectivity, and more often, if anything, working in the opposite direction, from the place of the collective, back to the individual.
Well, there's something really interesting that happens in these essays where you can feel her. I mean, this is in the 70s, right? She's already a kind of icon, and a particularly glamorous one. She's already been on the cover of Time for Notes on Camp. And you can feel her struggling, I think, to efface some of what makes her extraordinary. And there are even moments in some of the essays where there's almost a kind of flatness of tone, as if the attempt to efface herself is also doing something to her style. And the interviews, if you read the book, you'll see the interviews are where she kind of comes back in a much more combative way.
Absolutely. There's the interview where she's asked, how do you live as a liberated woman? And her first sentence in that response is that, well, that doesn't really matter, my personal liberation. Because I'm, become so much more interested in the collective. But yeah,
Well, I think we'll come back to that question. How do you live as a liberated woman, if that is even possible, or if that question even makes sense? But Sigrid, can I turn to you to answer the first question that I posed? How do you kind of scale, or how do you move from thinking about being one woman to this category on women, or is that even possible or desirable?
Well, it's interesting because I feel like I came of age where, it was undeniable that to be called a woman writer, you understood that it was to be called a lesser writer. That was inescapable, and that was something that was extremely difficult, for example, for Susan Sontag. And so she liked to say, and she used the word, beware of any kind of ghettoization Don't allow yourself to ever end up in that situation. Don't think of yourself as a woman writer. Think of yourself as a writer. And then, as time passed and I realized I do write in the first person, and I'm always aware of writing about women's experience, my experience, which I completely feel I'm sharing with women everywhere, also with people. But I mean, certainly women's experience is a big part of what I write about. Women making their way in the world, women aging, what that means. For Sontag, Woolf writes in A Room of One's Own about a woman's sentence, a man's sentence, and the difference. I mean, this is the kind of thing that drove her crazy. She would not ever accept that there could be such a thing as a woman's sentence. But when people have asked me, is it, do you get upset if let's say, I've been told, I read your work, I read your prose, and I can tell that a woman wrote it. And this does not trouble me at all. I guess I have many other things to be worried about than that. I do not take that as an insult at all. And but she would, she would. But I remember that when this came up in a classroom and a student said, a young man said, "Why would that be an insult that you write like a woman?" That was really it. You write like a woman. And his last name happened to be DeFazio. I said, well, it's like, hey, DeFazio, you throw like a girl. Then he got it, right? But as I say, I've never really, shared that feeling of fear that by writing like a woman or women's sentences or writing about women's experience that it made me, a lesser writer. I was aware that this was something that had to be dealt with, but I myself never felt it personally, that's what that meant.
Well, it's interesting. These essays come out at around the same time when you have a number of radical feminist writers who are writing for each other. And for them, there's actually a kind of political importance to having a voice that is marked by gender. Sontag is not writing primarily for other women. She's writing for a much wider audience. She's thinking about the purpose of the writing in a much different way from some of those radical feminist writers. And the collection, I think, raises a really interesting question that is probably still pertinent today, which is, on the one hand, she wants to say something about women, and she in particular wants to say something about the different sources and the different structures of women's oppression. On the other hand, she does not want to use the F word. She doesn't want to use the word feminism. And she describes the word feminism, or she describes feminism as a movement in her response to Adrienne Rich. She says, like all capital moral truths, feminism is a little bit simple-minded. And so I wonder if we could just think a little bit about this schism that we see in the essays between, on the one hand, the category of women, and on the other hand, the political movement that is feminism. How do you think about the relationship between women and feminism, either historically or today? You're allowed to say Sigrid.
I'm going to cash it in. Sigrid, you go first.
You go first, Sigrid.
Wait, just define that a little bit better.
Yeah.
What do you think of the and feminine? What?
Well, so, okay. So, one of the best essays, I think, in the collection is her response to Adrienne Rich's response to Fascinating Fascism.
Just to interrupt you,
Yes.
I have to tell you that when Susan Sontag had written her essay, Fascinating Fascism, which was not her title, but is the title that the New York Review gave it to it. And then they got in touch with her to say, you know, we have this letter from Adrienne Rich, and we assume you'll want to answer it. And she read it, and she said, you know, sometimes this kind of thing happens and you worry, how am I going to answer? She said, this, and she rubbed her hands together and she said, this is like putting a baby in the ring with Joe Louis. Oh, I've forgotten the question.
No, that's okay. That's a good story. No. It's a good. Well, I mean, I think you're right. Like, I think, you know, her response to Rich is to essentially call her simple-minded, and
which
to
she
call
should not have done.
Well, and to call. I mean, it's water under the bridge, I suppose. But to say that, to insist, or the nature of the response to Rich is to say that feminism, or the way that Rich is using the idea of feminism, is too simple. In part because Rich insists that Sontag read something, right? Read a film, read an object, through the lens of feminism, when Sontag would say, but no, that's not actually the right, or that's not the most interesting or important lens through which to read it. So the original question was just, what do you do with a person like Sontag, who on the one hand clearly had a great deal to say about women and about women's oppression, but on the other hand really kind of shied away or had an allergy to the term feminism and to the movement?
Well, I think it wasn't really necessary for her to shy away from the term or the movement. And the problem was that there were things about the women in the movement and how they behaved that she didn't like. Now, the thing with the letter that Rich wrote that really got under her skin was the suggestion that it's all academic for her. That she can write about the oppression of women and misogyny and this, that, and the other thing, but she doesn't really feel it. It's not part of her felt experience, and it's not part of her autobiography. And that really bothered her because she felt that it was, an unjust charge, because that's not what she was writing about. But I think that a really important problem for her was that she saw these women, these feminists in particular, as anti-intellectual, and that was, the big sin. How could she possibly ally herself with people who, because of some sentimental idea about solidarity and sisterhood and a certain kind of ethics, that you would be anti-intellectual, and if you were that, she couldn't really be on the side of that. And she did, she does say, in these essays, she does seem to be saying, no, she does say, I mean, that she finds, she finds something silly and boring and tedious about the way feminists talk about being a woman and being oppressed and so on, and she just didn't want to talk about it in that way. She didn't want to feel, she had a great terror of ever being seen as a victim. Yeah. And that was a very big part of it. So when she says, in a certain place, she says, I came of age, and I was very surprised when people would say how difficult it was to be a woman and make your way and be independent, because I had been doing it for years. And, and I didn't even notice, well, this is an absurd thing to say. I mean, how could she possibly not have noticed? I mean, it's ridiculous, but it was humiliating to think that you were not treated as an equal to men, either in your work or in any other way. And she was just going to say, it never happened. Mm-hmm. And then she was stuck in this strange position. Well, if it never happened to me, then the logical conclusion is it didn't have to happen to these women either. If they'd just be more like me.
But what's
Well,
fascinating there is also, I think, when we think of Sontag, we think of a person has many internal schisms, which is to say, there is the Sontag that we read in her public writing and the Sontag in her diaries that were published after her death. And in those diaries, they're just like replete with that exact kind of anxiety and doubt that her public persona of always being attached to authority and certainty, become completely questioned. And so I think for those of us who come to Sontag in a posthumous relationship, it's very fascinating because it's like you have the sort of like backdoor understanding of the dynamic that would have sort of placed her in this position to insist on, as we will talk about later in this conversation, the obliteration of these categories altogether. Whereas she saw these feminists as adulating or maybe even sanctifying the female gender in a way that she wanted to get past.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I want to connect two things that both of you said. I mean, the first was Doreen and Sigrid, both of your observations about writing or not writing in the first person and what the implication of that is for a sense of self. But also, Sigrid, what you said about how she didn't want to speak about it that way, because that is a question of style, of how it is that one chooses to speak about a subject and how the way you choose to speak about that subject is itself a judgment of the subject. And one of the interesting things I noted when I was writing the introduction and reading the essays alongside the diary entries was how often in the diaries there would be an anecdote that she would tell about precisely these feelings of humiliation, of being made to feel lesser than, of the anxiety that attached to authority. And then in the essays, she would say, a friend of mine told me about this experience. And it would be turned into this fictional character of the friend, or it would be objectified as a way of either projecting or expelling or repressing precisely what you're talking about, Sigrid, repressing that idea that of potential victimization, or maybe not even just victimization, but something much more basic, something like vulnerability, or something like having to occupy the same structural position that other women had to occupy. And that is a really interesting thing to track in the essays, when what could be personal becomes avowedly impersonal or third personal or whatever. I want to switch gears slightly. Sigrid, your last novel, which is really, really wonderful.
Thank you.
Yeah, it's actually the first thing I ever wrote about for the New Yorker, so it occupies a very special place in my heart. Called "What Are You Going Through?" is a novel in part about aging. There is an extraordinarily memorable character in it, a female academic who is a kind of vamp. She's getting older and doesn't want to admit or doesn't want to stop performing her desirability as a woman, and so sort of shows up at this event wearing something a little too tight, a little bit too made up, and Sigrid's narrator is observing this with a kind of sympathy, but also a kind of coolness. The first essay in the collection on the double standard of aging is about precisely this, and I wondered if we could talk a little bit about aging, about how you think that Sontag approached it, how you approach it in your fiction, and whether that is an interesting question for women.
It's because in my last book I do write about aging and mortality, and I remember somebody said, "Why are you so obsessed with mortality? Why are you so drawn to mortality?" And I said, well, really, it's about how mortality is drawing me. And it did strike me, writing and thinking about aging. I thought, well, here it is, the one thing it really isn't is boring. There's just, nothing boring about it. So, because I do use a lot of my own experience in my writing, I came to this point, being older, where it came very naturally to me to, to write about it. The part that you're, and also specifically about what it's like to be a woman aging, and then also this particular character in that book who happened to have been in her youth not just pretty, but exceptionally lovely, and what it did to her, how it actually, through no one's fault really, it kind of destroyed her to not have that anymore because it was so much a part of her identity. I've never really been able to figure out, whether Sontag is right and other people that this is really so strictly a woman's thing. I don't really know if that's true. Beautiful, beautiful young men, and then they change too. I'm not sure if it's so different to lose that. I really don't know. But this part that you bring up, where I have the narrator go to this lecture, and then this woman comes on stage to introduce the speaker, and the narrator identifies her as a type, the academic vamp, a certain age, but dressed in a tight skirt and very high heels, and everything sort of signaling, I may be an academic, I may have written books, this, et cetera, but I'm still fuckable. I think that was very mean-spirited of me. If I could go back, I would.
No, it's great. It's great. No, it's completely wonderful.
Why so mean? I did. I have some regret about. I think that's I think it was mean. I really do. And I didn't mean. And I thought, well, I didn't mean to be mean. But then what? You wrote it. And then I thought, that's what it is. That's what it is. That's what women fear, that they're going to be there in a nice, tight skirt and stilettos and looking very fuckable, and somebody's going to say something mean. There it is, right there.
Right.
Women being bitchy about another woman.
Well, I don't think you were exactly.
Okay.
I don't think you were exactly bitchy. But well, no, that's interesting that you should think about it that way, because that makes me then think of what you said about Sontag a little bit earlier, of displacing that anxiety onto other people.
Exactly.
And without analyzing you too much, I just wonder if you feel like that was part of what was going on there.
Well, that's what I mean. Why,
Yeah.
No, I think that's very true. I think it's about that fear, and then you put it. It's like, I'm going to write it out and put it out there.
Well, it gets at this kind of larger question that I think is threaded through the collection, which is the question of beauty. I mean, one thing we should never forget is that Sontag was both, in the words of her son, David Rieff, both an aesthete and a moralist. And this is a collection that is thinking very carefully, and at times in quite pained ways, almost, about the category of beauty. And it's thinking about that, too, from a position not dissimilar to the position of the academic vamp, let's call it the public intellectual vamp, of someone who was extremely publicly desirable and beautiful, but who is now sort of feeling that edge start to fade. And thinking a little bit about what you can do with the category of beauty to keep it something. I think she says in one of the essays on beauty, she says how you can keep it for women, how they can use it as opposed to having it be used against them. And there's something a little bit embarrassing or maybe superficial about talking about beauty, right? So Doreen, I'm wondering, is this an important or an interesting category? Is it too dated to be of any use? Can it only be mobilized in a sort of bitchy or punitive way? Can we do anything with that concept of beauty, or have we moved on from it?
I guess, so there are two very short essays in the collection about beauty, and in this collection that are about beauty, and in the last one, Sontag becomes so meek, describing to use a cliche, the shift in beauty standards that is happening in the 70s. And so she's describing seeing, that the natural look as inhabited by Black women with their glorious afros, which is an actual phrase that she uses in this essay. She sort of just says in a way that feels kind of like, tossed off, that this is like a good thing, that the category is being expanded such that that will destabilize our very one-to-one relationship between one's beauty and one's perceived moral station. And I guess the thing, I'm not even trying to sound like different or anything, but I don't think I've ever...
Have you heard what Sigrid just said? You're fine. Say whatever you want.
But I don't think I've ever really understood what people mean when they talk about capital B beauty, a standard that is not subject to any debate by, a notional public. And I think that in her sort of griping with it is something that I don't think is ever actually said, right? Like, what does that beauty look like? We supposedly, according to Sontag, know it when we see it, right?
Well, for her, it was Garbo.
Garbo.
Right? For Garbo. It was Greta Garbo, right? That's,
Yeah.
I mean, if we just needed an object.
But then it was also Lauren,
Garbo,
Lauren Hutton at times.
Right.
And then she has a really great dig made towards Pauline Kael and her obsession with Robert Redford. But I think that there is a presumptuous notion of what beauty meant at that period of time at the second half of the 20th century that I don't know. I mean, and this is the great issue with Sontag all the time, is her connection to what we might call like a larger audience of people. And I don't know that the way that she conceives beauty and the way that you have to make a lot of assumptions to understand is necessarily something that I've ever felt an attachment to or an interest in.
Sigrid, do you want to respond to that? That category of beauty and its importance?
Well, I think one of the things that everybody knows about Sontag is that she had very, very broad tastes. There was so much in the arts that she loved. This is one of the great things about her. And she was that way about physical beauty in people. She would say with a certain amount of guilt, to say, she says of Riefenstahl, she was a beauty freak. She said that about herself all the time. I can't help it, I'm a beauty freak, I'm a beauty freak. But it's like, she had, for example, I remember she'd been to Vietnam and she said, the Vietnamese people are so beautiful, like I was there and like every other person was like a movie star, But I have to say when she talks about the beauty of women and how, beauty is a power, and but for women it's a trap and so on. And she says these things, these sort of sweeping things like the only kind of beauty, that first of all, I think she exaggerates the importance in the world of women's beauty, almost as it's the only thing that anybody cares about, as if all the children of the world really care whether their mother is beautiful or not, right? I mean, it's always that about how it's this thing about beauty and it keeps women from being full adults and all this stuff. And she says women are only allowed this one type of beauty as opposed to men, which is the girl, which that's not really true. When I think about, people of her generation, Elizabeth Taylor her beauty was not a girl. Sophia Loren, Katharine Hepburn, Dietrich, Garbo. This was not a girlish beauty. I mean, the one beauty that I can think of that would fit that would be Audrey Hepburn. But she harps on that and the unfairness of that men are allowed to age and still be handsome and so on. I mean, of course, there's a lot of truth in that, but I really disagree with this idea that in our culture, that there's the only possibility for women is the girl, and of the beauty, the acceptable beauty has to be that of the girl, but also in her own, I never thought of her as somebody, because she was very, very good looking, but I never really felt that she would say, sometimes I look in the mirror and I think, hey, I'm really good looking, and then other days I look and I go, ugh, like anybody else, right? But she had this idea, at least for her, she would say, okay, you, Sigrid, you put on makeup and you wear clothes in a certain way, kind of, in order to tell people, look, I'm attractive. And she said, but, I feel like I will not do anything, for that. I will not wear makeup and try to, if you find me attractive, that's great, but I'm not going to do anything, And it was very, very clear what she was saying. Your way is the feminine way. My way is the way of men. And it was the same thing with her saying, why do you carry a purse?
She'd say that to you?
Oh my God, yes, that would drove her crazy. That women carried purses really, really bothered her, which she never did. And people weren't carrying laptops at that time or phones. She said, why don't you just always wear clothes with pockets? You have your cigarettes, your keys. You don't have to be carrying that purse everywhere. I mean, it really bothered her, right? Because that was a feminine, she just thought these things that women did that were so unreasonable, which weren't really unreasonable.
Well, she has this is where the diaries become important again, and where, again, we see kind of the personal peeking out through these kinds of claims, right? All of this is criticism of her mother. So when you read the diaries and you see the way that she describes her frustration with her mother and her contempt for her mother, and how do you deal when you feel contempt toward a person that you also love, right? So much of that conversation about femininity and its unreasonableness is circulated through her mother, but then gets turned into these kinds of categorical statements that you get in these essays. Sorry, Doreen, I interrupted. Go ahead. What were you going to say?
Well, I was just going to quickly say that there's her relationship to her mother, but also her general hatred of childhood. She is someone who, in her writings has, claimed to really disliked being a child and to not have this sort of packaged nostalgia that we often have to that period in our lives and how it may or may not have made us to be the people that we are. And so when I think about her equation of not only women and their beauty, but also women in their political station as being that as the child. She talks about women as being like minorities in the sense of literally being minor in the way that a child is a ward of their parents, a woman is a ward of her husband, and the nuclear family structure that she is beholden to. And so it's those two, the mother and this haunted child that kind of orbited her, I think, sort of, help us have a way into that.
Well, speaking about things she didn't like, which make up pockets, children, mothers, as we're putting that list together, I was thinking about an interesting piece that recently ran about the collection in The Guardian that starts with the sentence, "Did Susan Sontag like women?" And it's an interesting premise from which to begin, because the kind of unspoken or unstated assumption of the piece is that in order to generate a compelling theory about women as a subject position, or to speak intelligently about feminism, one has to like women, whatever that means, right? I'm wondering what you think about that. Is it possible for someone who does not like women or feels ambivalently toward women to theorize women, or is that liking a precondition for saying anything? And Sigrid, I'm thinking about your meanness now, which is, on the one hand, sure, perhaps mean, but on the other hand, incredibly illuminating at the same time that it comes from a place of not liking or of rejection or what have you. So is it necessary to like women, again, take that however you want, in order to say something important or interesting or compelling about them?
Well, I think that that was what Rich was really getting at. And maybe if she had had more time to write that letter, because there wasn't time to write it. Basically, I think she was saying that, yes, it's possible to write about all this academically and think about it intellectually, but, you know, underneath it, she was very suspicious of Susan's attitude towards women, and, you know, these two women knew each other. They were not strangers to each other at all. And, you know, the thing is that I mean, I guess it is possible because she did it. Yeah. She did it. But, you know, it's like, you know, a really revealing anecdote is this. It was actually one of my favorite stories about Susan, is that when she first started being published at Forrest Strauss, and her publisher, Roger Strauss, and his wife, Dorothea, they would have dinner parties at their townhouse on the Upper East Side. And at that time, it was the custom in that household, and I guess in others, that after dinner, the men went to one room, and the women went to another. And as Dorothea Strauss used to tell this story, it was so wonderful that the first night that young Susan was there, and she saw this happen, and was no doubt stunned, she, you know, the door to wherever the men were was closed, and she opened it, and she strode in. And from that time on, the custom was ended. And Dorothea would say, I've never forgotten that, seeing you with the door open and looking in. Okay, here's what Sontag did not do and would not have done. She did not go to the other women and say, what the fuck is this? What year is this? Sisters, please. Come, let's go, you know? And that, it's very, very revealing, because that's really, you know, she really, you know, just like the way I don't wear makeup, the way of men, you know, she wanted to be that exception. She wanted to be with the men. She didn't really, you know, she wasn't convinced that other women either wanted that or were able to do that. And, you know, in these essays, she skirts perilously close to blaming women, you know, for, as she says, for none of this could happen, what men do to us, if women didn't acquiesce. And she doesn't seem, you know, like, you know, this is she's talking about a time when abortion was illegal, birth control was, well, I guess birth control was just becoming available, but she doesn't seem to think about women's lives and the obstacles that they would have had to doing what she did, you know. So that, you know, like, so in a way, she didn't want to, you know, she didn't like weakness. That's why she didn't like, you know, the thing with children and childhood. She didn't like any memory of when she was powerless and weak. She's all about power and taking power. So she goes on and on in these essays that none of this is going to end until women take power from men. Well, I mean, the whole problem wouldn't exist if it were that easy to take power from men. You know, I mean, like, she won't, but she doesn't want to acknowledge that. She wants to feel like she did it, she was an exception, but she also wants it to be as if, you know, she wasn't an exception, that anyone could do this.
Well, the one place where she does want to acknowledge it is in, I think, one of the two most extraordinary pieces in the collection, which is The Third World of Women. It's the interview that she did with the Marxist journal Libre that was then translated into English. And there, you know, that to me is an unbelievable document, in part because she sounds so much more radical in that than even the most progressive policies that were being pursued in the name of gender equality or gender liberation at that time. And she says quite explicitly in that document, we need revolution. She says we need revolution, and she won't go so far as to commit to something like family abolition, but she says we need revolution. She lays out a kind of theory of social reproduction. She explains why she thinks sexual liberation is insufficient without economic liberation. And there she really does offer a kind of theory of patriarchy, which is what I think you're saying, Sigrid, is missing in many of the other essays. It's a theory of patriarchy that would kind of pull her back from the precipice of laying the blame at women's feet. And it's precisely that essay that Rich talks about, where she says, how could the woman who wrote this essay write this other piece? How could she possibly write this, how could she possibly write fascinating fascism? And you know, the other thing that it just makes me think of was how committed she was to the idea that she could do that she could make this argument about patriarchy and its political underpinnings in one essay, and then go on to make an argument about beauty in another essay. I mean, that seemed to her to be her absolute right as an intellectual. And I'm wondering what we think about that. I mean, this is her complaint with feminism too, right? That the consistency that it demands is a kind of, she allies with a kind of simple-mindedness. But it seems to me now that there are good reasons to argue for plurality of thought, and then there are reasons why we might actually want to be consistent from essay to essay, from topic to topic about things of this importance. What do you think about that? I mean, is that plurality something we inherently value? Is that the duty of the intellectual? Or is the duty of the intellectual to articulate a kind of consistent worldview and bring that with them to each topic that they touch?
I think in the case of Sontag, one is brought to remember that she was a novelist and wanted to really be a novelist and was not satisfied with her initial forays into it. And I think there might have been submerged within the essayist, the writer who more identified with the novelist's, compulsion to change their mind. And I think that Sontag is someone who, the frustration, especially for generations who want her to be their daddy and then realize, they go through their Sontag phase and realize that the coherence of politics is not existent over the career. It changes from time to time. And so I think, I'm dodging your question because I get nervous about answering questions like that, but I just find it
Tell
more
me why you
interesting.
get nervous about answering questions. I was nervous asking it, so tell me why you're nervous
Because I
answering
think
it.
my real answer is that the public intellectual, if that is a figure that we believe in, does not owe anyone that consistency. And that when you're in a situation where glamour and celebrity is conferred on this person and also this person courts it, that's when we have the problem. But is it necessarily their duty to become that spokesman that I had mentioned at the beginning of the conversation?
Well, one argument would be that they actually can't become that spokesperson unless they do court a kind of middle-of-the-road liberal politics, unless they have to be a little bit unreadable in that way in order to have the kind of appeal.
And what's amazing about that interview, which not very many people have read at all, maybe that will change now after the publication of this book, it's just a very strong disavowal of liberal politics. Yes. She talks about abortion as being part of this sort of incremental rights program that liberalism has set up at this time in the century. And it's could we have more of an answer to her proposal and what is happening right now with Roe v. Wade? That's all.
Well, no, and the way that gets linked, I mean, to me, this was the most extraordinary moment in that interview, the way that she links the questions of feminist emancipation to ecological crisis. Mm-hmm. That is the single most astonishing moment to me in that interview, where she talks about how we actually need a kind of planetary politics of degrowth in order for feminist liberation to happen. And she's trying to kind of not sound like a doctrinaire Marxist or even like a leftist, but you think, I mean, here you are saying something that feels genuinely fresh for the audiences that she was writing for in 72. And I wonder if actually writing for Libre and knowing it was going to be in a different language freed her to say things that she might not have otherwise said in English in, the New York Review of Books or wherever.
Yeah, and it's so interesting to read that piece and see where she says, particularly because of our concerns today, that she's suspect of abortion rights as she is of divorce rights, because she thinks it's something that the patriarchy just throws at women to keep them calm and quiet and not, and not producing the revolution that has to happen. It's a very interesting idea, and also her, basically she says there also, come the revolution, there will be no gender.
Yeah.
That was also quite radical, and where she, Sontag was identified as bisexual, and there's the place where she says, heterosexuality is learned, but so is homosexuality, she says. And she claims that, again, come the revolution, nobody would be a homosexual or heterosexual, everybody, again, like me. It's like, it's just, because I'm bisexual, that must be the right sexual identity. No, but I mean, it's still, there's just something, particularly this thing about, that gender, there would be, like almost only in her view, in a perfect world, as it were, gender would not be at all what we recognize it as now.
Right. Yeah, well, come the revolution, there will be no gender, and come the revolution, all pants will have pockets. Which feels like we're close to one of those things at least, right? I think this is actually a wonderful place to end. I'm looking at the clock. We're at about 9 o'clock. Thank you so much to both of you for all of these wonderful, wonderful thoughts and anecdotes and speculations. Thank you to all of you for being a wonderful audience. I believe there are drinks after this here and in the garden, so please join us, and if you had questions you wanted to ask, feel free to find us afterwards. Books are for sale, both on women and Sigrid. Which one of your books do they have up there?
Oh, Picador brought A Feather on the Breath of God.
A Feather on the Breath of God, also wonderful. So we hope to see you afterwards. Thank you so much for coming, and have a good night.
Thank you.